Hi there, this is Scott Skelly from Skelly's Farm Market, and today we're going to show you all about how we grow tomatoes on our farm. Now, tomatoes are one of those things we all love to eat in the summer, and there's a couple different ways we grow tomatoes. We grow some inside our greenhouses here, which we'll show you those planted in a minute, and we grow some outside. Now, the reason we grow some inside is right now it's early April, and normally you couldn't be planting tomatoes outside, right? Because even though today is nice and warm when we're videoing this, we're going to have lots of cold days, and we're going to have freezing temperatures, and frost and freezing temperatures at night would cause our tomatoes to die if they were going to be outside. So normally you wouldn't plant tomatoes until the middle of May or after outside, but right now it's nice and warm, in our greenhouses it's nice and warm, so we can plant tomatoes earlier. And what do you think that means? It means we can pick tomatoes sooner. So we can have tomatoes almost a month earlier than if we were going to grow them outside. So we're going to show you the life cycle of our tomatoes a little bit here today and how we go through. So when tomatoes are first grown, they're started in trays like this. And yeah, these are actually some of our tomatoes that will eventually go outside. And you can see all these little itty bitty plants. And they were started by taking some seeds, and we'd scatter seeds in the soil. We put just a little bit on top, and we put them in a special room where it's nice and warm for a couple days until they start to come out, because they like lots of heat when they're first starting to grow. So once they start to pop through the soil, we take them out of that hot room and move them out here to our greenhouse where it's more normal temperatures, 70, 80 degrees, depending on how sunny it is. And we got to make sure we keep them nice and watered. And eventually we'll move them into trays like this, where there's little holes and each plant will go in a hole. So we'll take each plant, we'll kind of dig it out, we'll make a little hole, and we'll move the plant over into the trays. So then they'll grow, and they'll keep growing, and eventually they'll start to look like a plant like this. And these are tomato plants that are ready to be grown. Now, let's go down and we'll take a look at what the tomatoes look like in the ground. So today we were busy planting some of our greenhouses. Now we got 5 greenhouses full of tomatoes, and this is the only one that has tables, and then the rest of the houses are for just growing tomatoes. And it's really windy today, so you can see our plants are actually blowing over a little bit, but these are all the tomatoes in the ground. So we went through with a machine, and first we put down plastic in here. And the plastic is buried in the ground, so that way it'll help keep weeds away from the plants. And underneath the plastic, we have this kind of hose. This is kind of like a soaker hose, but it's special pieces. Here you can see one that doesn't have water. And we go, and these hoses stretch all the way down. We have special connectors that we can basically build our own soaker hoses going underneath. So under that plastic, there's these soaker hoses that'll soak and put water under the soil. And this is really good for a couple of reasons. One, it puts the water right by the roots. So where outside, if we were to water something, you got to water all the ground, right? Because if you're using a sprinkler, it's going to water all the ground. Well, here, we're only putting water in a strip about this wide. So it's not going to be a real big area underneath that's wet. It's just where the tomatoes are. And by doing that, it's really efficient. We don't need to use a lot of water. It'll help the tomatoes be healthy. Now, tomatoes, just like us, can get different diseases and get sick and things like that. Maybe not viruses that take over the world, but we do have other things that can happen to tomatoes. And it's things that won't maybe get, hurt people, but it might just make the leaves turn yellow, or maybe they won't produce good tomatoes. But there's a few ways we can fight that in the greenhouse. And one way that tomatoes get sick is when it rains and water sits on them for a long time and they don't dry out. The water on the leaves is a good way that disease moves around on the tomatoes. So when we have that drip tape that goes underneath the plastic, the leaves in the greenhouse here, because we have a roof, it never rains in here. All the water is directly under the plastic, and the leaves never get wet. So that's one way that our tomatoes stay healthier, by staying in the greenhouses. And another way is the types of plants we use in the greenhouse. Now, outside, when you have tomatoes or other crops, maybe this year when we plant our tomatoes, next year that will be pumpkins, and then the next year it might be corn. And we'll move those tomatoes and corn and different crops all around in the field. And that's called crop rotation. And when we rotate crops, that means that maybe one of those diseases that might make a tomato sick wouldn't make a pumpkin sick. It's just different things. Just like we can't get the sicknesses that tomatoes get, or the pumpkin sicknesses, because those are only for plants, right? And just like that, a tomato can't get the flu or some type of sickness that we might get. So every plant's a little bit different on what things can affect it. So even if some of the sickness that hurts a tomato sticks around in the soil one year, the next year, if there's not a tomato there, there's no way for the sickness to stick around, and then all of a sudden, it'll be fine. So a pumpkin would be fine to plant in that ground and not carry the sickness. But if you think about our greenhouses, we can't really move crops. These greenhouses are used for tomatoes every single year. So we need to find some creative ways to help get that sickness out of the soil so that the tomatoes can stay healthy. And one way we do that is we'll actually come through in the winter sometimes and scoop some of the dirt out of here and take it out in the field and bring fresh dirt in. And that'll move some fresh soil and it'll help take care of some of that sickness that might be sticking in the soil over the winter months. But there's some other things that we can do also. And one of those things is called grafting. Now let's take a look at some of our tomato plants here. And you'll see these tomato plants are a little crazy. It looks like there's actually little stakes on them. But these tomatoes are really cool. So actually, these are two different, every plant is actually two different tomato plants. And if you look really close, let's see, let's flip it around here so you can see. Right here, there looks like this little scab. And as what happened is these were actually two plants that we cut apart and put together. So there's one type of tomato on the bottom plant, and that tomato is really good at making sure it doesn't get sick. It's got really good genes and is immune to a lot of the problems. But unfortunately, that plant doesn't produce very tasty tomatoes. They're kind of ugly, they won't taste good. They're just not tomatoes we probably want to eat. But on the top, we have this plant that has really good tomatoes, that they're really good to eat, but it's not very good at fighting off those diseases. So we grow two different plants, and then when the tomatoes were, maybe this tall, we actually go and cut both plants apart. And the plant on the bottom that was really good at fighting disease, that stayed right in the soil, and we cut it off right there, and we go and actually attach another plant, the one that's tasty, on top. And if you look, this little clip's fallen off now, but that little clip would have been around and helped hold that tomato together. And that's a process we call grafting. And grafting is not real common in plants like this, although it can be done. But things like apples, where you have an apple tree that might be not super tall. Apple trees in general are supposed to be really tall, maybe like the pictures we see in books and children's books. But apples, if you ever go to an apple orchard, the trees are actually fairly short, and that's because they've combined two different apple trees, a dwarf tree and a tall tree. So we can do the same thing with tomatoes, and that helps them be healthier and stronger and be really cool. So back here, then we have our tomatoes that are growing. You can see we have these wooden posts on the ground. Eventually there'll be strings that get run between all those posts, and that'll help tie and hold the tomatoes up so they're not falling on the ground. Those will start to go in the next couple days here now that we got the tomatoes planted. And eventually these tomatoes will get up really tall. They'll be even taller than the posts, and there'll be just almost a thick wall of tomato plants going down these rows. And eventually they'll start growing flowers, and those flowers will turn into green tomatoes, which eventually will become red tomatoes. So pretty cool. And you can see we have different colors of plastic in here. The white will actually reflect the sunlight, so it stays a little cooler, and the black will actually help warm up the soil. So we just try different things to see which might work better and do some experiments of our own. All right, well, we can walk outside real quick. Hopefully the wind doesn't blow us away here today. And we'll look at the machines that we use to put down those plants in the plastic. So right here is our transplanting machine. And this machine, right on it, and there's a special thing, and this is pulled by either a tractor or in our case a skid loader, and it pokes holes into that plastic. This wheel will spin around. It'll dump some water into the wheel, and water actually goes into the holes as it's planted going through the field. You can see we got a tank on there to hold the water. So we can use this to plant melons outside, or right now we can actually drive in the greenhouse through a special door to get inside. And in our shed we have another machine that helps put all that plastic down. So that's pretty much how tomatoes grow. Hope you learned something, and maybe this summer you'll be able to try out some of our tomatoes. See you soon.